Okay, it is 9 o'clock on the dot, and welcome everyone. There are 30 people who have either Zoomed or called in today, and this is new technology. We haven't, I'm not sure we've ever tried this with a Maine Woodland Owners event, so that's fabulous, and I hope that you'll bear with us as we're even novice Zoom users. I want to give people a quick, before having Jen Hicks and Tom Doak from Maine Woodland Owners start us off, I want to just do a little technology check. There is, in Zoom, if you videoed using a computer or your phone or iPad to join us, in the lower left of the screen should be where the mute button is and the stop video, or turn on video if there's an X through it. Sometimes it works best if we start to have a lot of freezes in the video. We may want to turn off some people who aren't speaking. Same with, it would be great if you could mute unless you're asking a question, and that'll cut down on background noise. We do have a number of people who have joined by phone, so they'll be listening in. They won't be able to see the screen. And we will just do a call to, ask for questions. Jen is pointing out that I forgot to turn off the fireplace, and you're still getting the crackling noises from the fire. So let me turn that off. There. Did that cut down on the background noise?
There we go.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Brenna. We have the other thing I wanted to mention about Zoom, on top of the mute button and the video button in your lower left, is that there's also a chat button, which should be off over to the right. And that's where, if your video or if your audio is not working very well, you could type your question into there. The same as if you want to kind of reserve your spot, because we may all start talking at one time. You could, into the chat, you could say, I have a question, and then I'll try to help moderate. And I guess the final thing is, we haven't done this before, so it's a real test, and we'll do the best that we can. I'd like to see if Jen or Tom would like to say a few words. We'll give them a little time to unmute here.
Hi, this is Tom. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. First, I want to thank Bob and Jessica for doing this. And so it's great to have you both doing this. And so thank you for doing this. This is a brand new adventure. And as you say, we've never done this before. We do have a long list of ideas. If this works out, we have a bunch of ideas on how to continue these. So it'll be interesting to see what people think, and certainly give us some feedback afterwards, and also on topics that you might like to have us do this way. So thank you all for this, and we'll keep doing this, I hope. So thanks so much. Jen, do you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I'm thrilled. This is a great turnout, and we are, as you can imagine, making lots of mid-course corrections on how we deliver our content and information to our members. Ordinarily, we much prefer to be face-to-face in person with everybody in the woods, but there's something really neat to think. We've got people from Canada calling in. We've got people from other states. I got some feedback from people saying, this is great. I can never make your events, so this is a great way for me to be able to do this. So there's a silver lining in all of this, but I would prefer to be in the woods right now. But this is also going to be very informative. And the other part is we're going to record this. We're recording it now. So this will actually be posted on YouTube and then on our website. And so it will be available for anybody who has missed it. So if you know anybody who wanted to be on but couldn't because of the timing, this will be available hopefully in the next few days after we have our event. So, and please reach out to me if you have any suggestions on how this worked. Or any other comments. And Bob and Jessica, thank you so much. And I'm hoping this is not the only presentation you'll do. So we talked about not every Friday with Bob and Jessica, but maybe several. We'll see. We'll see how this goes. And thanks everybody for being here. And Bob and Jessica, it's all yours.
All right. Yeah, I would, if we may have non-members, people who are not yet in Maine Woodland Owners who have called in today because they saw it advertised on Facebook or through another means. And if you're not a member, it would be great if you would consider joining. One of the great membership benefits of Maine Woodland Owners is the newsletter, the monthly newsletter that comes out. And that's Bob shares with Max McCormick the silviculture column that is in every month's issue of the newsletter. And that Bob's been getting some emails from members who have various questions or have to comment on the articles that he's been publishing. And so that's why we thought it might be fun to do this as a forum and have this avenue. So I'll just give a little more additional background about Bob as the silviculturist here. He has 35 years of experience as a professor of silviculture at the University of Maine. He's a Society of American Foresters Fellow and also a licensed forester in the state of Maine. With that, I think maybe I'll allow Bob to say a few words. Final caveat would be that Bob is here. Bob, if you know Bob, he's very opinionated, knows a lot, and so, as such, his opinions are his alone. They're not representing Maine Woodland Owners. He may give advice that Maine Woodland Owners is very careful about landowners making their own informed choices, and we try to provide information that lets you make those choices that are right for your woodlot and your land ownership objectives. So Bob's his own silviculturist. And would you like to say—
How about that? Yeah, for an intro.
What motivated you here?
Well, I mean, this goes back to my education, I think. I was fortunate enough to study with David Smith, the esteemed silviculture professor at the Yale School of Forestry, who sadly is no longer with us. But among many great pieces of advice Dave had for me was that, he says, Bob, you need to remember that you may have a great career doing silviculture research and teaching, but if none of it ever shows up in the forest, you have accomplished nothing, right? Silviculture is not just a theory, it's an applied discipline. It's like medicine and law and other things. And if you don't go out and practice it, right, it doesn't exist. So that's driven me my whole career. So the reason I volunteered to do this was just, you know, on the chance that this may be a way to reach people that ordinarily wouldn't able to get their questions answered about some silvicultural issue that's interesting to them. And, you know, given the circumstances, what better way? Why would I volunteer to do so? I've never done this before. Lots of webinars, right? It's very scripted, but never just open to random questions. So we'll see how this goes. If I don't know the answer to something, I mean, that's not the end of the world. we can go look that up. And this will be fodder for my columns, right? I mean, if good questions come in, we can continue to write about these things. So who's first? Jay, we had a question from you, right?
Yeah, let's see. I think Jay, let's find Jay here. Jay Hall. Jay, you are showing that you have audio capabilities. So I'm going to unmute you. And let's see where. I lost Jay now. There we are. Jay, why don't you try chatting here, or talking?
No, we're not.
Okay, that's not working. So I have Jay's question here. Jay emailed his question to Jen Hicks. And so for others, if you end up in that boat, Jen at mainwoodlandowners.org is another way to ask a question. Jay sent his ahead of time in case his audio didn't work, and it looks like that's the case. So Jay is from St. Albans, Maine, and his question he had 3 questions, all white pine related. And the question was, we'll start with the first one. Silvix of North America says that white pine distribution coincides reasonably with July temperature averages of 65 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 1/2 to 2/3 of precipitation in the warm season. How likely will climate change impact white pine regeneration success?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Reflects some pretty advanced understanding of the silvics of pine. I guess I would fall back on the history of that we know from studies of pollen from lake sediments and other places where we can reconstruct the past climates of New England, Maine in particular. If we go back, people on the UMaine faculty like George Jacobson have done this and written, there's an excellent article in the Journal of Forestry maybe 20 years ago about this. If you go back to around 5,000 years ago, white pine, red oak were much more common in Maine than they are now. That's a time when it was a bit warmer. I think it was also a bit drier. So we have, this is a bit of a puzzle because we're looking at obviously warming temperatures to some degree. But if the climate scientists believe that we're also going to become wetter. So we have probably opposing factors there that's going to be hard to sort out. I'm going with the warmer on this one more than the wetter because in my career here, it's obviously we don't have the cold winters anymore. I think pine will be increasingly well adapted to central and even northern Maine. And, you know, it's got lots of silvicultural issues, but it's the devil we know, right? We know how to manage them all. The weevil, blister rust, other factors, the needle cast issues seems to be another nasty one that we're beginning to understand better. So I think pine is going to be better suited to, not worse, to our region here, say in central Maine. And without really worrying about where it's, you know, the home of pine, of course, in Maine is southern, you know, old field, part of old agricultural Maine. I don't think that's threatened. I think the issue with pine isn't climate really, it's the maturation of the old field resource that's now largely in saw timber sized trees being harvested. People are making money off of that, and the challenge will be to make sure pine regenerates as opposed to other species that are of lesser value, at least to us now. So that's I guess one answer to the white pine question.
Great. And our next question is going to come from Joan Nass. Mm-hmm. Let me head over here to see what we have.
Can you hear me, Jessica? This is Richard.
Ah, Richard Nass. All right.
Joan owns the whole thing, so my name is not on it. Here's my question. So we have 135 acres of white pine and red oak in Southern Maine. We're in between major forestry activity, and I harvest 5 or 6 cords of firewood every year. And I go out in the woods and I look at these stems that have grown from stumps in the past, and maybe especially red oak, and maybe 2 or 3 stems coming out of what probably was a stump, and they're now 10, 12, 14 inches around, and I'm tempted to cut 1 or 2 of them off. And I would love to know if that makes good forestry management activity. Sure is easy to harvest the firewood that way. Question is it the right thing to do?
So Richard, these are trees like firewood size, like 5 or 6 inches diameter?
No, I'm thinking more 10, 12, maybe even 14.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Maybe some of the 4 or 5, yeah.
Absolutely, you can do that. And that will be actually the subject of my next column, not the one about to come out, but the future one. And that is the ability of trees to sort of compartmentalize decay from wounds. So stump sprouts are not, they're connected below ground, obviously, in the same root system, but they tend to do things like red oak and red maple will tend to, if you cut off, say, 2 of 3 stems, And we've done this, actually, we're just out on our woodlands yesterday looking at some red oak trees, which, 12, 14 inches. If you're cutting with, chainsaw and hand crews, or in this case, you're just doing it yourself, right, with your saw. As long as you're careful not to damage the trunk or the bole of the crop tree that you're leaving, then you should be in good shape. In fact, those trees will respond incredibly well because now they've usurped the root systems of what were formerly two of their competitors, right, for above ground resources. So that's absolutely a good idea. The better practice is to do that soon when the trees are still saplings. Just cut them off with clippers or small hand tools you can. And favor, what you want to do is, in this case, favor the lower origin or stems that originate lower on the stump, not higher. If you cut low stumps, you'll automatically have sprouts that come from low situations. If you cut high stumps, you don't want sprouts that are coming off the top of the stump, stool sprouts, we sometimes call those. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. All right. I'm going to mute you, Richard. And we've got a chat. Charlie has asked, he says, weevil season is upon us. Have you tried physically blocking them from attacking leaders? I've seen nylon stockings suggested as a screen. Do you think a biodegradable cap would work? I was thinking perhaps a tube made from newspaper.
Okay, so we're trying to combat the weevil here, which will, let's see, the weevil, of course, overwinters as an adult in the forest floor and will emerge, just been studying this, after about, 25 to 50 growing degree days, above 50 degrees. So that's more like early May. The weevil will, around here at least, typically the weevil will emerge. And I don't honestly know. Obviously, if you put a nylon stocking over the leader, that will keep what happens is that the adult flies up to the tip of the previous year's shoot, the leader, right below the terminal bud, and will begin to feed and eventually mate and lay eggs in that leader. And when the larvae will then hatch and feed downwards in a spiral, and that's what kills, and by girdling the terminal shoot, and you get meanwhile the new growth is forming for a while, but that eventually gets choked off, right? So anything that will prevent that weevil from attacking the shoot physically, a physical barrier, will probably work. The technique you mentioned here, that's known in the lake states, we were just out in Minnesota and got a real lesson on this from John Ryla, who practices bud capping. Out there, the pines are attacked more so than here by deer. They're another herbivore, so I'll just nip the buds off and the shoots. And during the winter, when of course that's all they see above the snow are green pine shoots, and apparently the deer out there like them better than here, although we've been getting some attack in some of our properties as well. And if you staple a bud cap, you just take a little, being prepared for this question, you just take, here's a pine shoot, if you can see it, you just take a piece of paper, put it over the tip of the pine. You have one of these hand staple guns, and you just clip it in a couple places like that, so that paper is now attached. It's held on by the needles. Now, whether that prevents weevil attack, I don't actually know. It probably would tend to, if anything, make the weevil attack a bit lower, which might happen. I think my gut sense is that if you really want to prevent weevil, you need to use some kind of insecticide. And what the regime there, Robbins used to do a lot of this, and so did other landowners. I'm not sure what they're now doing. By just wetting down with a hand sprayer the terminal shoot with some appropriate insecticide. I think bifenthrin is one of the ones that's now used. I've not done this, although we intend to try some of it this year. That is obviously way faster and more efficient than going around stapling paper or putting nylon stockings over the terminal. So I think if you had like a favorite tree in your yard and you had some old nylon stockings, then by all means go out and put one over it. But if you're trying to manage, 500 trees that you planted, like in our case, 4 years ago, that are now up and being attacked by the weevil, I think you need a more efficient system. But I don't know, it's hard to find much about this in the recent literature. It was one of those practices, spraying for the weevil, that was much more common probably 40 years ago than it is now. But we're going to try some, so.
Good. Maybe we should, there's no new chat questions, so we can have someone who's joined. You could unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll allow for a little pause there. We might have multiple.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, I'm Merle Parise.
Merle.
Merle.
Good morning, Merle.
How are you?
Good.
Good. I'm a forester down here in Newcastle. And I have a question about shoreline zoning management. I'm seeing a lot of amateur management in the shoreline zone. I'm getting a little bit concerned about it when it comes to timber harvesting. And I feel that the area really needs to be professionally managed. The 40% rule is a good rule, and it's really in place for erosion control more than anything. But we need to have a very vigorous forest, especially in the shoreline zone, for uptake of nutrients, like phosphates. And I think that this area, when you go in and look at this area, you really need to understand the basal area, the stocking levels of it. And many people out there don't understand that. Professional foresters do, but many of the landowners don't. And they're going in and using the 40% rule, which I think works good sometimes, but it's really not what you should be looking at. And that's my comment on that. Thank you. And I'll mute.
Okay. Well, I think you've hit upon, I mean, shoreland rules are in place not to enforce some high level of silviculture. They're in place to protect water quality and maybe on larger water bodies, aesthetics of, you know, canoeists and other people that are using the rivers. But so the key, the silviculture applied there should be something that conserves, you put it very well, vigorously growing vegetation of all layers, right? Not just overstory canopy, which the shoreland rules would tend to enforce, right? Because you're only measuring I think the 40% applies just to merchantable trees, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 40%. Is it volume or basal area, but in a 10-year period that you can remove?
I
Is that
think
right,
it
Merle?
goes from 4.5 inches up.
4.5, right. So
Part of it.
good, thank you. So there are obviously times when you can't abide by that because the stand is falling apart or whatever. You have short-lived trees, and you know, if you're going to cut what's going to die anyway, you're going to exceed that. I think clearly the silvicultural goal for these zones should be some kind of multi-aged, or at least two-age kind of silviculture where you're promoting vigorous overstory trees, but ones where you don't have dense canopies where you get what the condition we call stem exclusion, where there's no understory, right? The canopy is so heavy that you have no light coming to the forest floor. So you would want to promote. So in the 40% rule in theory would allow you to do that. But I guess you'd have to elaborate on what the amateurs are doing to before I could critique that further. So I think the basic principle is to try to promote multi-age silviculture that would keep, you know, good, lush, vigorous trees growing at all canopy layers. And that's not the easiest kind of silviculture to practice. You can have young, vigorous stands. They're fine for 50 years, right? The deer yard in northern Maine story is the same thing. They were great for a long time, and then they eventually, because they were largely fir, timed out and all died. So we went from lots of cover to no cover. So
What I'm seeing, if you want, what I'm talking about is I'm seeing really a harvesting of all the good stems, high grading the stand,
yeah,
mostly, and pretty much destroying the undergrowth, taking out all the undergrowth that's there. There is a lot of people who want a vista across their property, and there's nothing wrong with that. But still, when you get down into this shoreline zone, we have to maintain this young growth coming up. And it's within 75 feet, there is a rule that goes to that. But after the 75 feet, it's gone. You don't have to maintain that understory. So that's what I'm seeing here. A lot of high grading and not maintaining the understory after the 75 feet.
Yeah, and 40% is 40%. It can be the 40% and the biggest and best seed-bearing trees, right? So, which is obviously not what we want to do if we're trying to maintain vigorous multi-age stands. I don't know. I guess that's a matter of, getting more professionals to engage in the management of those zones. This is not a silvicultural question. It's one that we know what we should be doing, and it's a case where the regulations probably don't impede it. It's just that they don't necessarily enforce it maybe strongly enough, especially with the regeneration part of it near the shoreline. That would be critical. Have some kind of, if you have those rules where you don't have machine traffic within certain distance of the water body, that probably helps that some, but you can still damage an awful lot by falling a 30-inch pine, right? You'll wipe out a tenth of an acre of regen in that if you do that improperly. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Merle. All right, Larry Beauregard has used the chat box in order to ask a question, and he said, "Hi, Bob. I'm planning a patch cut on my woodlot in Old Town. Any thoughts on the size it ought to be? Should there be remaining basal area? Should there be established regeneration?"
Larry, I can tell you were one of my students a few years ago. Yeah, the answer is yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts about patch cuts. Patch cuts really not a silvicultural term. It's just it's something that's arisen because a patch is generally thought to be some portion of a stand, right? So it's an attempt to regenerate relatively small relative to the total area of the stand, areas within a larger polygon of stands. So the first thing is, if you're not, I believe that the size of the patch is not the critical factor if you're going to regenerate in this group-wise fashion. And I'm a big fan of doing this, but that's only because I also strongly believe that these patches ought to be, there ought to be some retention of trees. And I guess that's what you're asking about. Should there be remaining basal area in the patches? And the answer is almost always yes, unless you're trying to regenerate. I guess the only exception I can think of to that is if you want back pure aspen, any retention in the gap would inhibit that, especially if it's other larger aspen. We do the opposite. I don't want to be growing perpetual aspen. I will leave scattered aspens in gaps to inhibit the suckering, both because they're root grafted. The big trees inhibit suckering as well as shading the developing regeneration. So if you leave a light retention, like say 20–30% shade in the patch, you can make the patch any size you want because the geometry of the light in that doesn't matter anymore. A lot of what we used to teach and still do in silviculture about the size of patches has to do with the fact that we're not at the equator. We're at 45 roughly degrees north latitude, and we have a pretty severe sun angle. So you have shaded sides of patches, or these could apply to strips as well, and sunlit parts of patches. So if you want a large area that's sunlit and no retention, then you want to have a patch that's at least a ½ acre, if not bigger, if you want to regenerate something that's shade intolerant, like particularly aspen or maybe paper birch. If you want to promote, on the other hand, trees are going to make you more money, like pine, red oak, all the intermediate to shade tolerant species, then you definitely want to get well-established advanced regeneration in that patch, which means you're going to need to leave some shade. So, 1 or 2 acre groups under regeneration with some light retention, to me, are just fine. And they don't act like 1 to 2 acre clear cuts, right? They just act like little mini shelterwood conditions within the stand. And that's a great way to promote phasing in more of a true multi-age silvicultural system by taking an even age stand, taking 20% of it, say, putting them in like, 1/2 to 2 acre groups with some light retention of your best seed bearing trees, right? This is what you want to regenerate. Keeping, as I just wrote about in the last issue, you want to keep light shade over all of the ground. You don't want bright sun because that's, except for in the aspen case, you'll get better regeneration with light, diffuse light coming in the forest floor. And of course, leaving the good seed bearers.
Okay. I see that Dick from Norwich Walk has raised his hand. That's another Zoom function. You can, I'm going to lower his hand. I don't know if that was accidental, or maybe Dick, you do have a question. You're
yes. Yes, I do have a question.
Excellent.
Around balsam fir. I've seen a lot of balsam fir die off. I have 90 acres or so.
Yeah.
And all different sizes, small to large. And just wondering if you have any good explanation for that.
I can try, and I think I do. We certainly see this on our own lands, both our personal lands and the lands that I helped manage for a long time at the university. My guess, strong hunch, is that that's from the balsam woolly adelgid. It used to be called the balsam woolly aphid. It's an introduced pest that came into Canada, almost probably a century ago. Used to be limited just to coastal Maine, in the coastal Maine fir forests, because of it is killed by very cold winters down to like -30 Fahrenheit for a week or so. We'll take the aphid out. We're no longer getting that, so we two different harvests in the last 3 years. We've have mostly, I wouldn't say entirely, but have been strongly driven by the need to pre-salvage cohorts of merchantable fir that normally I wouldn't have gotten too worried about because they're not particularly old. They're like 40 years old. They're on vigorous sites, and they go from healthy to dead in like 3 years. And my guess is it's from the woolly adelgid attack. And it's just another reason not to rely heavily on growing fir, although fir is a wonderful tree. If it weren't for all these pests that fir had, we'd be our favorite species for sure, because it's easy to regenerate. It grows fast. It grows over a wide variety of habitats. It's worth money if you grow it to sedwood size before it gets rotten, all of that. And we're going to have a lot of fir. So you need to stay on top of your fir. It's one of those real cases where you need to be, eternally vigilant about your land and walk it every year. And you can start to see the symptoms of the adelgid in the crowns of the trees. They just start to look a little weird. They become distorted. The adelgid is a very complicated insect, and I don't fully understand it myself. It seems that our damage on one land in particular, the fir back in the wetland part of the forest was relatively healthy. The fir on the upland part and the more mixed wood with red maple and other hardwoods on good old ag soil was just, I had 12-inch fir that went from vigorous to dead in like 2 years. And we lost probably 2 cords, 3 cords an acre of this stuff over a good sized area because it's, don't practice what I preach here, right? This is, I wasn't quite on top of that. And, so I guess it's the adelgid. It's not the budworm for sure. You would know the budworm's a longer deal, and that's mostly limited to northern Maine if it's here at all. I'm not worried about the budworm, but the adelgid is a real nasty.
And so your suggestion is to keep an eye on it and then cut off the larger stems?
There's an old, we have an old axiom among a lot of foresters. The question is, when is the best time to cut a merchantable balsam fir? And the answer is when you come to it with a tool that will do it, right, or a market. So that doesn't mean now, in this harvest we just did, you can cut the pulpwood market for fir up in this area has actually come back. We're getting a little bit more money for it now. So you can cut right down to 4.5, 5 inches for pulpwood. I'm leaving those trees because I'm going to be back probably in 15 years, and there's 5-inch trees with healthy, short trees that are only 25 years old should probably be left. 5-inch trees that are 50 years old and 50 feet tall should be cut, obviously. So, but anything bigger than that, 6 or 7 inches, I would take it because, then you get, of course, the economics of harvesting, right? It depends on you doing your own work or you're contracting the logging. You have to have a certain volume, right? So that works against you here because I think it's clearly an age-related thing, but it's also, I think, vigorous. So sadly, we have this axiom that maintain tree vigor and that'll save us, right? That's often not true. And weevil hits the most vigorous pines. I think the adelgid hits the most vigorous firs. So, that just, so especially where you've got that nice, fast-growing fir that's 10 inches, I would harvest that.
So
even if it looks healthy and looks like growing stock, something you would not do for almost any other species, right? Because it's obviously, you can look at it looks healthy, okay, but it will turn from healthy to dead. And for reasons that I don't understand, and I think that you talk to entomologists about this, and they don't have a clear answer either. They will give you some insight into life cycles, but I don't think we understand it well. But it's a clear consequence of warming climate sadly, that we're getting this adelgid attack where we didn't used to. I mean, you see it way up in Rangeley and Lincoln and, you know, places you never see it before. And where are you now? You're up in Solon? Or where?
Norwich Walk.
Yeah, Norwich Walk. You went up to Norwich Walk. Yeah, you would have never thought to see adelgid there. Even 10 years ago, I wouldn't think. But now it's probably there because it's just moving, right? So, yeah.
And if I cut one down and look at the tips, what am I looking for adelgid?
Oh boy, now you're on. There's a woolly stage. You'll see woolly like residue on the twigs. It doesn't always go through that stage. The obvious symptoms are when you drive by and the leader stops growing and you get this sort of like an old-fashioned TV antenna, kind of a top on the tree where the leader's now no longer forming and the lateral branches are sticking out sideways. That's an obvious sign that you have kind of a chronic infestation. You'll see these in yard trees. But sometimes, I mean, there's no obvious symptoms on some of these trees that seem to go from live, healthy to dead.
Good.
So,
Hey, well, thanks a lot, Bob.
you're welcome. Yeah.
All right, Chip Bessie has chatted in a question, and he says, Bob, your comment about patch cuts encouraged leaving shade. Shouldn't we be cautioned about providing ideal conditions for beech?
Yes, of course. So Chip, I think the answer, there's a subtlety here. I'm not talking about, beech will thrive under relatively heavy shade. Like, so we're leaving, say we remove 30, 40%. And of course, beech loves that. And if you have a bad beech problem, I'm a believer that managing light in any way almost is not going to take care of that problem. But so like in most silvicultural decisions of this sort, what you really want to do is shift the light regime from one that favors the species like beech or fir that in this case are very shade tolerant, that you don't want to favor, to things that are more intermediate like white pine, oak, others, or even intolerance like your paper birch. And of course you do that by letting in more light, but I think people tend to overdo this. I mean, there's this old, I think this has now been somewhat discredited, at least it has in my mind, maybe not as broadly as it should be. Large patch cuts where everything gets laid down on the ground, where you have beech in the understory, and that's supposed to somehow get rid of all the beech. The only case where that works is where you have other advanced regeneration of species that are going to then outgrow the beech. In that case, it will work. Like if you have some reason you have pine around there, you have oak, you'll have yellow birch, you'll have even sugar maple will tend to outgrow beech in brighter lit conditions. But if those species are not there, they're not going to come into that gap magically somehow. And you're going to have just another awful thicket of beech. So the important thing is to make sure you have that advanced regeneration. This is why I always, especially with all the herbivory problems we have with deer now, the understories are much more depauperate than they used to be. And this is another whole concern of mine. Makes it even harder to regenerate things. So that I think leaving good seed sources is also critical in these patches, right? Or gaps. I like to call them gaps or groups, not patches. And they can just be scattered around. A few big pine or oak trees is all you need, right? And then you get, the real enemy here is the mid-story of shade tolerant trees that just clog up that growing space and interfere with diffuse light coming to the forest floor. So the ideal canopy structure is one that maybe 30% cover, 70% open. And this is true whether you got a 100-acre stand or a 1-acre gap, by the way, right? So that's, to me, the perfect condition to regenerate our species. But that's not going to work if you have an interfering, we call it, level of shade in the mid-story. So I'm talking about vegetation that's maybe between 1 meter and 4 or 5 meters off of the ground. So if you have that mid-story of beech, there's just no, if you can't cut it because it's not yet merchantable, then you're going to need to go kill it. There's just no other way around that. We have, effective ways to do that. And that can, of course, we've talked a lot, Max has written a lot about this, and I plan to do so as well. We just use the Husqvarna backpack chainsaw, which is an interesting tool, the 535 FBX that you can actually buy in the United States. Incredibly efficient at sawing off 1 to 4 inch beech, and then Jessica comes behind me with a little spray bottle of glyphosate and kills those stumps. And that beech is out of the picture. You've seen this, Chip, on our woodlot up in Wickapee. that actually sounds very tedious, but it's incredibly efficient. You can do, even I, at my age and my decrepit knees, can do 1 or 2 acres an hour. Just swaps out, right? And we get, I mean, we did like a 10, 12 acre stand in one day easily. And that, if you look at the cost of that, now we get the beech is gone, right? It's gone from a real problem to gone. And we have this beautiful canopy above this of northern hardwood species and some conifers. And if the deer don't eat them all and they begin to regenerate, the conditions are now set up. So I would caution you against very heavy cutting to get rid of beech. It doesn't work automatically. The only case that works is where the advanced regeneration, the trees that are already there of the other species are going to be there and outgrow it.
All right. Anyone who's called in on the phone, I think there was one caller on the phone that had a question. I want to make sure that you have a chance to jump in. You may have to unmute your phone. Let me do that real quick. Okay, I think I've got the phone callers are able to talk if you have a question.
Hi, this is Larry Totten. I have a question that's maybe not quite silviculture. Apparently the state is developing a 30-year plan of carbon sequestration. I'm wondering what that really entails to the silviculture or to our forests. If anybody's familiar with that plan.
I don't know the specifics. Of course, we do have the Governor Mills Climate Council. What's happening in the forestry arena, I am not on top of. We've been, of course, discussing this at length. It's fixing carbon is from the atmosphere is the same as growing wood, basically. That's the process, right? I mean, the carbon is fixed in the cellulose and the xylem tissue that we all know about. So any practices that promote more growth of wood and in long-lived species, especially, because we don't want that wood to die and rot away, because then it goes back into the atmosphere through respiration. We want to promote photosynthesis. So just looking at the growth part of it is easy, right? So we just want vigorous forests, but then the harder part is harvesting, right? Is removing large trees that have lots of carbon in them, especially when they only go to, products that have short lives out there in the chain, product chain. So that's obviously a negative. And Ken Loston and Lloyd Erland wrote about this, and I think are going to continue to write about it in the newsletter. Hopefully we'll get some clarity about that. I think, to me, there's been some studies, and the most influential to me have been silvicultural systems that grow long-lived species, what we call later succession species, things like sugar maple and even, white pine would be an example, red oak, hemlock, if it weren't for the hemlock adelgid, I guess. Those trees that are stable and grow to large sizes and fix lots of carbon, and then harvesting them on relatively long rotations so that more of the wood from those trees goes into long-lived forest products like building materials rather than paper and packaging materials, or worse, energy. Now, energy is another conundrum because, of course, if we burn wood, it obviously releases lots of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's all, of course, if you think of that as a cycle, it's sustainable versus fossil fuels, which are not. That's even more controversial. But in terms of the silviculture, growing long-lived species on long rotations, harvesting them for high-value products is probably the best way forward. It turns out that reserving things, I mean, some people would argue, well, we just need to reserve large blocks and not do anything. For, I think, decades, that's probably a good strategy because obviously the more it's being sequestered than it's being removed from mortality, eventually that will probably catch up with you. That becomes a steady state at some higher level than it is now. some people have gotten carbon credits. If you read your newsletter, the front page article for that, for some reserves, and that's just because the stocking in those reserve stands are higher. But in the long run, I think growing them to large size and then harvesting, selectively for those long life products, I think is probably the winning strategy. Of course, in order to do that, we need markets for the low grade wood, firewood, pulpwood. We're always going to have those things, and that gets into the whole life cycle analysis of those industries, and which is a whole other issue.
I don't
Well,
think
you're singing the same tune that I would like to sing, because that sounds right. But I'm hoping that we don't go and start selling 100-year plans to California, which TNC and AMC have both done already.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to take too far away from silviculture, but maybe Tom would like to chime in with a little update on what he knows about what's going on in Augusta with the Climate Change Council, specifically related to carbon markets.
This is Tom Doe. There's a lot of conversation going on because there are markets now. There's a regulatory market, the California market that Larry mentions. There's also a voluntary market, and those tend to be 40-year commitments from landowners. The regulatory commitments 100. There's just a lot of conversation going around about forests. I think I'm not sure. There are people that want the state to have its own carbon program. I'm not sure that's going to happen. Frankly, I don't know where the money would come from for that. But
Yeah.
one thing I think people are agreeing on is can we create some incentives to keep forested land as forest land? I mean, that's where you start.
Amen.
And about 70% of the carbon in the forest is below ground, in the soil, below ground anyway. So if you keep it as forested land and in pretty good condition, you're doing a lot already. So I think the focus is likely to be there, and then possibly some practices that might be carbon friendly that could then, assist as well. But there's nothing been determined, and nobody is talking about a regulatory approach to carbon. So if anybody's worried about that, I haven't heard anybody argue that we're going to regulate the forest to grow more carbon. I don't think anybody's talking that way.
Yeah.
But I'll keep writing about it, and then we'll have others will write about it. And I'll as soon as we have another meeting of the Climate Council, I'll provide an update in the newsletter.
Right. Yep. It also, Jen mentioned that in the next article, there's going to be something about soil and carbon. So stay tuned for that.
Jessica, can you hear me?
We can barely hear you, Doug, but we'll be quiet and then.
Okay, I'm sorry. My connection isn't great. Just to add to what Tom said, because I'm on the same forestry working group, if anybody has a desire to read up on this subject in all its complexity and varying views, the Climate Council has posted a bunch of documents on their website. I don't have that handy, but you could easily Google it up. They're, as long as this virus lasts, you will have reading materials if you want to go there. It's kind of across the spectrum, but I think Tom is right. At the working group level, it's gravitating towards some very practical recommendations. I don't think people should have great fears.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Doug. Okay, are there any questions? I've got another one from Jay that I could ask if no one jumps in.
I'd like to chime in on the carbon issue a little bit and the sequestration. Are you seeing any information coming down the line for silvicultural improvements concerning the mycelium network in the soil? There's a lot of talk these days how increasing the amount of mycelium networking in the soil amongst the trees and the fungi will help the growth and also increase the amount of carbon sequestration in the soil.
To be frank, I don't know. I'm not aware of that work. I know that I don't know if anybody here that's studying it in Maine. There are people in other regions that have some evidence of that, but I don't know what's going on here, and I don't dare comment. Maybe others on the line could.
I do see that Tom has his hand raised. I think that's Tom Doak. Is that true, Tom?
Yeah, but a different question, a different topic. So if you're when you finish this topic, I have a question for Bob. That's all.
Well, apparently nobody else has any more info than me.
All right.
So I'll check. I'll read up on that. Yeah.
I know there's
Thank you.
growing interest, so sure.
Yeah.
Tom, okay, you had a question.
So a little different subject. Manage your approach to ash management in light of EAB. I know you've done a lot of on your own lands and a lot of thinking. You both have been doing a lot of thinking about that. Can you talk about your approach to ash management?
Yep, and maybe define EAB for
EAB
some
is
of
the emerald ash borer. It'd be hard not to know what that is right now if you're living here and reading the newsletter. A nasty introduced pest that until recently, I think we were alarmed that it was going to promote consequences akin to the chestnut blight, which is essentially no natural resistance anywhere in the ecosystem, at least that was apparent in the first wave of disease that came through and wiped out our chestnut from the overstory. Recently, and this goes back to the article I just wrote a few months ago in the newsletter, a study in Lower Michigan went back into some of the areas that were infested in the very first time during the borer's existence, and found that a lot of the white ash, not the green ash, not the brown ash, black ash, had survived, and it was obviously attacked apparently. Now I've not seen these stands, so I don't know, but this was published in the referee literature, so you have to trust that it's met high standards. So what we are doing is, in Maine, most of ash in Maine, I sense on the upland old field sites that we're dealing with here is white ash, so that's good for us. And we're promoting essentially crop tree management, just like we would do any other sawlog quality species, right? By growing them rapidly once they reach the medium pole stage, right? So doing heavy crop tree release when they're 4 to 6 inches, 20-foot spacing or so, and then growing them on out to, this is like any silviculture, it's site related. The better soils are gonna grow trees faster to larger sizes. And to get those trees to large size where the markets will reward you for it, you need to get them up to 16, 20 inches DBH, 2 or 3 log merchantable heights, and you'll make a lot of money doing that. I see no real reason not to continue to try to do that if you're growing white ash. So we are absolutely not cutting any ash sawlog tree we come to just because to try to get our $15 for it now when it's going to be worth $100 in 20 years, right? That just to me would be foolhardy. Partly because we can, I suppose if a calamity strikes and we're wrong about the white ash, we can always salvage those. And as it appears from other regions, New York, other, robust ash markets, the price does not get unduly depressed because of heavy, panic salvage cutting by landowners. The other thing is that I said in the article, and we had Colleen Tierling up there talking at length about this. And if you come to this year's annual tree farm celebration, which hopefully will be underway by September, second weekend in September, you can see this, where our ash management in both, pole size and large saw timber stands. The one thing I regretted doing was cutting some pretty large, not high quality fence row ash that I could have left as trap trees. That's a technique that I was vaguely aware of until I read up on it. I did not did understand the importance of that. I know other landowners, Mike Dan, for example, you girdle some trees every year, and it acts as a great censusing device for the integral ash borer. We can, you fell the trees, you girdle them in the spring, like now, you could girdle them now, I guess, or maybe a little later, as soon as the growing season starts, and then they will, of course, send out pheromones, I guess, or not pheromones, some kind of compounds that attract the adults, and they will then you fell the tree and you will find them in the galleries. And if you don't find them, of course, you have no boar. It's a way better census method than the pheromone traps and the purple traps that they had been using. So people want to contribute to that network, especially in regions that are not yet infested, which thankfully is most of Maine. I think that would be a good contribution. So I cut too many of ours, and because I did, the 20-inch ones and bigger probably weed. I mean, that's our target size. So at some point you want to take your money for these valuable stems. So, but I would not. I think that we've got an awful lot of 16-inch, fairly vigorous 3-log ashes left in the residual stand, and I've seen, I think, too many cases where people are cutting those, I think, prematurely. Just because of maybe an overreaction to, or maybe just an unawareness about this resistance of white ash versus green ash. If you have green ash, and sadly, the black ash, the brown ash, we call it here, in the lowland forest, does not seem to have that. And we just, again, wetland forest on property in Kenduskeag has a lot of that out there. I left it because it's not particularly high value. And, we'll just, I guess, have to see. It's kind of like monitoring. Right, you monitor it, and once you know the boar is around, then if I had a lot of brown ash, I'd cut it, I guess, if I wanted the money for it.
I'll mention, in addition to the September 12th Forestry Field Day event at Wikipedia Woods, where our tree farm won for 2020 State Tree Farm, there's another event that might be of interest to you that's being put on by Somerset County Soil and Water Conservation District. It's going to be August 29th, and it will be focused on ash and beech management. Bob and I will be joining Peter Pfeiffer and Joe Dembeck and others on Peter's land. He's done a lot with both beech and ash management. And it's going to be a great tour because his driveway is about a mile long, and all the stops are going to be along the road. So we're going to sort of walk along the road, duck into the woods, duck back. I think it's going to be good. We have 3 minutes remaining, and so I think I'm unfortunately going to have to cut questions off. We had Roger Merchant calling in from Glenburn wrote in the chat box about his carbon forest management course, an online course he took at Michigan State. He wanted to make sure to mention that silvicultural practices that enhance carbon storage should be designed to maintain a diversity of ages and sizes in the structure of forest stands. And then Chip kindly just retracted his question. He had asked about species that could maybe have assisted migration, and we have in fact done that ourselves on our land. So maybe if people like this format, that could be the first question next time.
Okay.
Jay Hall had 2 other questions that we didn't get to. He wanted to know about clearing space under white pine crop trees in order to promote white pine regeneration, and how that should be done, managing around your crop and seed trees. He also had questions about shade tolerance of white pine seedlings. So we'll save those. Maybe Bob can study. If he doesn't know the answer, he could study up on those, but it is his favorite tree species.
Yeah,
so
whoa, that was a close one. I thought I was going to have to answer that one. No.
All right, Jen Hicks I'm gonna unpin this video and let Jen say a few final words, but we had up to 40 people who called in today, which is just fabulous, and thank you, and we'll let Jen wrap it up.
I was just thinking, and Jessica, you can weigh in, but if there are more questions after this is over, please email me, and then I'll communicate with Bob and Jessica about trying to answer them. But we're sort of trying to create this type of feature in our newsletter, but it can be fraught with peril, as you can see. All the questions asked took Bob a little while to answer, and we want to make sure we're clear and not misleading and when we respond. So it's a little harder on the newsletter. This format seems to be a little bit better. There's always follow-up questions, I'm sure. So I'm happy to receive those from anybody. Jen at JENN at mainwoodlandowners.org. And maybe there's a part 2 where we just continue the Q&A format, but we will be discussing how we'll proceed from here. But I think this was very successful, and I appreciate everybody's participation in this. And again, and even if it's, you just want to make a comment about how this worked, what you'd like to see in the future, we'd like to respond, to people's needs. And that's the big part of our mission, is to support woodland owners and resource folks. So again, appreciate it. And Jessica, I'm just going to reiterate Jessica's message of, if you're not a member and you thought this was useful and helpful, please consider becoming a member. It really is the membership that our membership program that does help us develop these types of events. And it also gives us a chance to be directly connected to you. And as we have resources, we like to send them out to our members. So being a member has a lot of benefits, including our monthly newsletter, which I see these videos, these Q&A sessions, these types of webinars as an extension of our newsletter. So this will be kind of an exciting new adventure for us. So appreciate everybody's involvement and interest. And thanks to Bob and Jessica for offering to be the first, the pioneers.
I think this was fun for me. I love this, and I'm happy to continue as much as people wish.
I think the technology, in person is always better, but since we do need to make do right now, it was fun to talk about forestry for an hour.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it's a very small community of I think people that like to connect with each other, make sure that we haven't lost touch with what's really important, and that's our good forest management techniques. So thanks. Tom, did you have any thoughts, or did you want to say a final word?
I think we're good. I appreciate it. I'm sure we're gonna do more of these, so we'll stay tuned.
All right.
All right.
Goodbye.
All right.
Do some woodlot work on the weekend, guys. Go.
Yeah, send pictures of you out in the woodlot too. I'll take pictures. Any photos of people working in their woods.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be careful what you wish.